Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar from the Denver Association of Business Economists. I'm David Hansen, president of DABE. Thank you all for participating. To let everyone know, we are recording this webinar and we will post it next week to our website. I just have a few announcements before we get started. Hopefully you saw this in our newsletter, but DABE recently partnered with UC Denver's Economics Department to award a scholarship to 2 outstanding undergraduate students. And we are really excited to participate and partner with UC Denver again next year. UC Denver has been a great partner with DABE for many years, as many of you know. Also, we will be back on July 15th to host Jason Corzine of the National Park Foundation. So we're really excited about that. Today, we are hearing from Scott Wasserman, president of the Bell Policy Center. Throughout the presentation, our DABE Vice President, Ryan Gedney, will be collecting questions, and he will lead a Q&A session at the end of Scott's talk. So to submit a question, you can see down at the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen that there is a Q&A function. So go ahead and submit your questions during the presentation using that Q&A there, and Ryan will take your questions at the end. So let me introduce our speaker. Scott is going to be talking about the economics of the middle class. The Bell Policy Center has conducted a lot of great research on the state budget, labor and wages, and many other issues impacting our state. Scott has served as the president of the Bell Policy Center and the Bell Action Network since August 2016. Scott was Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor John Hickenlooper and Chief of Staff to both Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia and Lieutenant Governor Donna Lynn. And so with that, let me turn it over to Scott.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. I think the only thing that could make me more nervous than talking to a room of lawyers would be talking to a room of economists. And so I guess if I can do this, I can do anything. And I say all that because I am not an economist, as you can tell from my biography. I've worked in state politics in one form or another for the last 20 years. I've worked down at the legislature. I've helped to set up a labor union for state employees in the state. I've worked inside state government. And I think all of that has, led to this opportunity to lead the Bell Policy Center. And I've been doing that for the last 3 years or almost 4 years now, really trying to refocus the Bell Policy Center's mission. Some of you hopefully are familiar with the work we do. Our entire mission and focus is how to ensure economic mobility for every Coloradan. I think for much of our time, we've spent a lot of time focusing on a variety of issues, but we've focused very heavily on fiscal issues in our state, and I'm sure none of you are any strangers to the unique setup of Colorado's fiscal constraints, and then the sort of paradox, at least we see a paradox at the Bell Policy Center, between what is a pretty markedly prosperous state economically, yet a state that also underinvests in public sector programs and services that we, at least for a long time, have felt like are very much connected to the economic future and prosperity of Coloradans, and as we'll talk about in a second, in particular, the middle class. So I'm going to share my screen here, and what I want to do is I'm going to walk through some of the findings that we were able to reach a couple years ago, and then maybe talk a little bit about I think where this research should go next and what we think some of the important implications are. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Can you see it?
We can, Scott. It's not in a slideshow.
Yep, I'm about to do that. So, okay. So you see it now?
Yep, looks
Great.
good.
Okay, cool. So just by way of background, so I think when I came on board at the Bell, I had sort of, a few things had sort of become clear to me. I think in the progressive economic advocacy space, there's clearly a lot of passion behind drawing a connection between public investment and sort of low income working families and families below the poverty line. We have a lot of groups, the Bell Policy Center included, that spend an awful lot of time making the case that investments in Medicaid, investments in human services, investments in education all have this uplifting effect for families in poverty or just hovering above that line. But one thing that I felt was just sorely lacking in the political dialogue was a conversation around the middle class. And I think that I think all of us have gotten really used to hearing the phrase middle class as a rhetorical flourish that politicians use as a justification for a lot of decisions in tax policy. But the more I felt like I was scratching below the surface, the more I personally felt like there was very little clarity as far as who the middle class actually was. I had heard a variety of definitions. And then to go even a step further, it seemed to me, based on some basic literature review, that there was just very little work that had been done to quantify the costs, the cost pressures facing the middle class. And even, I remember I was in Washington, D.C., and I'd gotten a chance to meet Jared Bernstein, an economist who's worked with Joe Biden and a lot of others. And I asked him, I was like, has anybody ever really done any work between public investment, the dollars that flow through the public sector, and how that, impacts the middle class? And it was, he kind of scratched his head and said, no, I don't know if anybody's really done that kind of an analysis. So I think from our perspective, for a variety of reasons, we felt like this was a really important project to embark upon. So we reached out to University of Colorado and worked with Todd Eli and Jeffrey Profiter, who some of you may know, who really led the research on this project. And the entire intention was, let's just do an exploratory dive into this question of who are the middle class? How much money does a middle class family have to make to be middle class? And what, if any, connection is there between public sector programs and services and the health of that middle class? So, just by way of background, just two other things before I just kind of dive into the research more specifically. I think the Bell kind of has just a little bit of a different kind of twist on income inequality. And I think, from our perspective, it's not so much the gap between the very, very wealthy and then the very, very poor. I think for us, it's a conversation about, certainly that's a part of it, but I think it's also a conversation about a shrinking middle, and that the gap between the wealthiest among us and the poorest among us is getting bigger and bigger, and the people who exist in the space in between are getting fewer and far between. When I give my presentations and some of this data is getting a little old, I think it's really important for the general public, and I think people would be shocked. I think people are shocked when they kind of figure out like what it takes to be in the top 1% of Coloradans. And at least when this slide was produced in 2018, one only needs to make $410,000 a year in order to be considered the top 1% of income earners. And the average annual income of the bottom 99% is $55,000 a year. I think I throw that out there because I think that this conversation around the middle class, everyone has an idea baked into their head. I've encountered people, and I'm sure we've all encountered people who might make $400,000 a year and say, I'm middle class, right? But in point of fact, if you look at the data, they're actually in the top 1% of income earners. So I think it's important to ground the conversation about middle income and middle class, which I would argue are two different things, in some hard facts about who's where in our economy. You know, another thing, and this was another point of inspiration for this work, was thinking a lot about the self-sufficiency standard. Self-sufficiency standard, as many of you know, is produced every 2 years. The Center for Law and Policy produces that report, and it's an attempt to come up with a basket of services and goods that a family needs to be able to pay for in order to be self-sufficient without public assistance. And we know, based on the latest report, that 27% of Coloradans live below that self-sufficiency standard. So again, I just think it's so critical that we ground people in facts. And I think that when I've shared this information with a general public audience, people are not only shocked that $400,000 a year puts you in the top 1%, people are also shocked that over a quarter of Coloradans are living below the self-sufficiency standard. When you look at that self-sufficiency standard, though, I think one of the things, when you look at the data, you start to see some contradictions. For instance, if the median wage in the Denver metropolitan area is somewhere in the middle 60s, and yet the self-sufficiency standard for a family, for a family of 4 that has, say, a toddler and then a kid in elementary school is also in the 60s, what does that say about the self-sufficiency standard? And furthermore, if the traditional definition of middle class, which, my understanding is that, for a long time, the Pew Foundation has defined middle class as 2/3 of median income up to 2 times. Well, that means you've got some significant overlap between people who are, quote, self-sufficient and also middle class. And I guess one of the assumptions behind this work is that you cannot be, self-sufficient and middle class. There should be a distinction between those 2 definitions. And I think that's the spirit with which we approach this work. This work was in the report, and what you can see here, just based on the existing definitions of how we see lower middle and upper middle income families. This lower line here, the blue line, is your upper income families. Up top, you see our lower income families. Up top, you see our middle income families, and then in the middle, you see our lower income families. And what you see here, I think, is a cleaving, right, of between the upper, on the one hand, you do have upper income Coloradans increasing in size. You have middle income families decreasing as a percentage, and you have lower income slightly increasing. So over time, this is not a good trajectory to be on, right? And this is all, based on old definitions of, say, middle income being 2/3 of median income to 2 times. So obviously these are really small increments, but as all of you know, is that if you express this over time, and given the kinds of shocks that we're going through right now, if you believe in a healthy, vibrant, thriving middle class, this is not a good chart. And I think this is what's worrisome to me today looking at this, is that this is a snapshot of when things were, relatively good, and we have no idea what's about to come. So getting into the research, we found a few things with this that I'll get into. So one is, I think we really need to redefine, based on the research that we put together, what that income range is to be middle class. It's not 2/3 of median income to 2 times. You should, and I have a graphic here that I'll get to in a second. So I'll just preview it here, right? So here, I think this is just a good visual expression. So previously, definition was 68,000 to 206,000, for the middle class. And what I think we're suggesting in this research is that you really ought to move that band up by about $20,000 a year. And I'll talk to you in a second about how we got there. Sorry to keep skipping around here. I think another observation is 2 earners are really essential to making the income that's necessary to afford the aspirational middle class budget that we're talking about here. And I think that's particularly in public policy conversations, I think that's really essential to understand that if you don't have two income earners in your household, in your family unit, that is really going to undermine your ability to get into the middle class. And I think an old-fashioned notion of middle class, Americans is, in the 1950s, the ability to have one income earner, making money, one stay-at-home parent, being able to afford things like a house and a car, recreational opportunities, that has vanished, right? If that ever in fact existed. But what our data is showing us today is that you really do need two income earners to be able to achieve the level of middle class that we're talking about. We also, know in this report, because we tried to take a very, budget-based approach to defining middle classness, childcare, higher education, housing, these are really the hurdles that families are facing. And at least two of these are connected to public funding. Childcare obviously is subsidized for many families at a variety of governmental levels. Higher education, I think, absolutely has been underfunded over time, and we've got a lot of data to back that up. And here in Colorado, government does not play such a big role in housing, but nevertheless, like these three expenses really are the dramatic expenses that families have to overcome. I think too, something that really resonates with me in this too is that I think there's a perverse tension between the demand of paying for childcare and the demand of saving for higher education. And maybe we could chat about that a little bit later. But if you are spending all of your money trying to pay for childcare early on in your life, which you're not doing is saving that money for higher education down the line. So I think in understanding the cost pressures that families are facing, we can also understand how those interact with each other. And these things are also responsible for debt. And if you look, I'm not going to be able to drill down too much into that today, but if you look at the report, we do spend a lot of time. And I think there's a big open question that I invite all of you as economists to think about, which is in order to attain a middle class lifestyle, how much debt are families going into in order to just pay for the things that I'm even talking about here: childcare, higher education, and housing, let alone consumer items and other things that people might pay for. And then I think too, just another thing, I think that a lot of us I think a lot of this work kind of has to do with perception. And, I think that oftentimes when you're working on public policy issues, there's this belief that like everybody has, that kids are in the mix in a wide variety of families. But what we found in this report is that only a quarter of middle income families have children in the home, and that indeed families are having children later. And I think I've seen a lot of national work done on this topic. It probably has to do with a lot of different factors, but there's no question that families are making this calculation and understanding that childcare, higher education, housing, these things are expensive. And it is, I think, forcing families to delay having children, and then that of course has all kinds of other implications. So those were sort of the top line findings. I just want to give you here, just a little look at how we built, if you will, the basket, right? And so what Eli and Jeffrey did is they basically looked at sort of three different versions of middle income, right? There are the people who, if you will, are sort of lower middle class, right? Just barely breaking into this category. There are the people solidly in the middle, and then there are those people that we might perceive as upper middle class. Why I think this work is so important is, what they tried to do is not just speculate generally. I think they tried to really break down, okay, like what is, just like in the self-sufficiency survey, which is an incredibly detailed process and looks at, the cost of certain goods and services and then calculates that basket. This is what they tried to do. And, I mentioned earlier this issue of debt. You can spin deficit any way you want here that you see in red. For families who are just just barely getting into middle income, based on the things that we would argue, are priorities for middle class families. There's about $14,000 unspoken for here. So either that is paid for in the form of debt, or that is something that is just foregone, right? And I also want to touch on this too, because as I've talked to a lot of different groups, like a fun way to warm up the room is to ask people to maybe share what they, in their mind, think of when they think of a middle class lifestyle. And it doesn't take too many people until you get people saying things like vacation. So I think too, like an interesting difference between the self-sufficiency survey. I mean, when I look at the self-sufficiency survey, that is bare bones. I mean, that presumes you're not going out to eat. That presumes you're not trying to get a vacation. And when we say vacation, I don't think we're talking about trips to Europe. I think we're talking about getting away for a couple days, maybe having the luxury of going to the mountains. And I think for many people, when they say middle class doesn't just mean covering your basic needs. It also connotes this idea of affording some basic luxuries, like a vacation, like sending your kid to summer camp. And so we also tried to build some of that into these baskets as well. And I just think the biggest takeaway here is that unless you're really in that double median income, in order to afford all of these things, you're either going into debt or you're just not affording those things. I think what's also a little scary is to see that even if you're double median income, you're only getting by with, say, $2,700. You're not saving a ton of money beyond retirement and college. So I think this is another important hallmark, and I welcome you to go take a look at the report in more depth, where they go into a little bit more explanation of how they calculated these figures and numbers. But to me, this is one of the first glimpses, if you will, of if you think about what a middle class life is made up of, and then try to translate that into an expenditure based definition, this is what you get. So I'd say another key distinction in this work is the difference between an income-based definition and an expenditure-based definition. And I think that there's a big difference between those two things that we need to be thinking about. And then, so I showed you this earlier. So, based on those baskets, this is their take on where, an actual definition rooted in expenditures deviates from the more popularly understood 2/3 to 2 times median income definition. I won't spend too much time on this, but I do think that this is an interesting chart, because we also wanted to look at, okay, like what jobs then could actually put you into the middle class, based upon what we know about what those jobs pay, and based upon the work that I just showed you in terms of what it might cost. So, this is like a really depressing chart for me. I won't lie. I mean, I think that while we are hearing this great public conversation about, plumbers can make $200,000 a year, or not everybody needs a college degree. I think the reality is that if you look at a lot of this data, it's really it's the higher educated professions that are putting people into the middle class, and that a lot of the jobs that I think there's an American narrative about, you can work in food service or healthcare support occupations or personal care, and if you save, you or your child can end up into the middle class. And I think based upon a survey of what these jobs are paying and what it actually takes to live a middle class lifestyle, I think you can see here that in point of fact, there are a lot of jobs in this economy. And I think what's worrisome too is that, healthcare support occupations, personal care and service occupations, if you look demographically at what's happening in our state, those are going to be the high demand jobs. But those are not jobs that are going to propel people or their families into the middle class. So I think, and I share all of this with you with the invitation to look deeper into all of these questions. But I think, for instance, I'm participating in a conversation with the Denver Chamber, about how do we move more people, up the economic mobility scale. And the reality is there's a lot of jobs that just right now you could work those jobs your entire life. You will not move up the economic mobility ladder. And so unless we begin to either pay people in those positions better, or we think more aggressively about the kinds of benefits associated with those, there are fewer opportunities to move up into the middle class than I think many of us think are out there. So, just some more facts distilled down. I mean, clearly, like we have a cost problem. I mean, as all of while we've seen a little bit of growth in family income over the last decade or so, costs have outpaced those gains in income. And here you can just see a comparison between college tuition, healthcare, and housing versus the historic growth we've seen in family income since 2000. So that's a huge issue. Talk a little bit about the importance of having at least one graduate degree. That's really critical. So to me, it's a little concerning that families are wrestling with the cost of higher education on the one hand, yet it is absolutely essential, at least today, to have that degree to earn the kind of income you need. And then in a lot of cases, that means being a manager. And in the report, you'll find a much more detailed breakdown and analysis. But it really is people who are in management, doctors, lawyers, the people that you might suspect. Those are the people who are in the middle class. And so, I think higher education. So my takeaway here is higher education is just a huge part of this picture, and we might want it to be different, but the current reality is showing something other than that. So when all is said and done, this is kind of where Todd and Jeff kind of landed, which is, based on an income, if you look simply based on income, we have a much rosier picture of families in the middle class, and you see that nearly half of all of Colorado families are in the middle class. But when you move to this sort of expenditure-based model, that number really drops, right? And so you can see the income-based definition: 2 adults, 2 children, 57% of those families are in the middle class. But then when you move to this expense-based definition, now you dip below 50%. And so, I mean, I think my hope with this is that it sparks a conversation of like, are the people that we think are in the middle class really in the middle class, or are many of them just scratching by and are probably a little bit closer to self-sufficiency than we would like to admit? And so I think, to me, this question, the report was a good step forward. I think it raises more questions than answers, because I think what it tells us is that there are different ways of defining middle class, that all of us have different perceptions of what it means to be middle class. And, I was asked just to share a little bit about what I think the implications are in a post-pandemic world. I mean, the bottom line is, I just think that our middle class, which I think America is really proud of and touts as like a huge, component, the American dream. I think middle class families are tremendously vulnerable. And so when we talk about, economic shocks happening, I worry. I think many of us are familiar with that figure that was like 60% of American households can't, withstand an expense greater than $400. I've thought about that a lot in this time period where so much is uncertain, where people are losing jobs, they don't have the kinds of savings that they need. We've done a lot of work at the Bell on retirement savings. We know folks don't have the kind of access to retirement savings accounts that they need. They're already struggling to pay for higher education. We've seen the childcare model in particular, I think, has been really stretched thin by this crisis because of the instability that it's created, in terms of who's showing up. Ratios are off now in the childcare sector. So, I think obviously, as a progressive economic organization, we spend a lot of time thinking about public the role that the public sector can play in all of this. I'm not blind to the fact that a lot of this has to do with things going on in the private sector. But if we as a state cannot figure out how to better, better subsidize higher education, how to stabilize the childcare market, how to make sure that we have low income housing, I guess our overall take is that our shrinking middle class will continue to shrink, and that income inequality as a larger issue will get bigger and bigger as that middle shrinks. And I guess the final thing I would say is that, it's our perspective that democracy is on the line. I think there's a lot of documentation to suggest that there is a close relationship between a vibrant and healthy democracy and a vibrant and healthy middle class. And so for us, beyond the economic implications of this report, I think it raises concerns if we have this big sort of, gap between the well-to-do and everybody else. The bridges, the lines of communication, the avenues for understanding, they all go away. So I'll simply close by saying, it's great to be able to share this work with you. I really do invite you to look at Dr. Eli and Dr. Profiter's report at length. And I think for us, we need more of this. To our knowledge, only a handful of states have even done this kind of an analysis. And this was just step one. And we really need to do more of this work to do a deeper dive and maybe understand better and for me, the long-term goal is, and this is maybe a provocative question, but like, does raising taxes hurt the middle class or help the middle class? Is there a relationship between the amount of dollars invested in our public programs and services and the overall financial health of the middle class? And to me, at least, this report shows a few key areas where it's very possible that paying a little bit more in taxes will actually help to lower costs in some of these really critical areas that middle class families are struggling with. So that's my presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That was great. Thank you. As we kind of kick off our Q&A, I'd like to go ahead and ask you a question or two.
Yeah.
Before I turn it over to Ryan. And I think you touched on this. You had a chart showing kind of jobs that could lead to middle class and yes, that chart right there. Yep. Likelihood of entering the middle class. I know I've seen things looking at regional differences in the likelihood of like moving from low to high, that type of thing. What is the probability of that moving from low to middle income?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, as I've come to understand that, right, is that if you look at that far left-hand corner, I mean, these jobs both have a very low probability of getting you into the middle class to break in, and then by definition, make it that much harder to move up that rung. But then, I do think if you're in that healthcare practitioner, education and training, sales and related occupations category, you have a higher chance of moving your economic mobility. I mean, I think that's also a good question to ask is like, what does it mean to be in the far right upper top corner, right? So I think that to me, what that says is there's greater mobility in these occupations, no guarantee that you'll get into the middle class, but that there are avenues. So I think, and it's hard to make generalizations, but I think it's just what is the most money you can make in these professions? And yeah, there is a pathway for healthcare practitioners, but at the end of the day, if you look at that next box, there's just simply greater likelihood of, and I think why I think this is important is, as many of you know, there is a conversation in the higher education space about helping students make educated choices about the programs that they pursue, which I think it's a dicey and value-laden area, but like, I think this should be a part of the conversation. because the reality is that, yeah, if you get that healthcare practitioner degree, is that going to get you to where you really want to be? And I think there's just a conversation and a debate about that.
Ryan,
David,
are you
am I
okay?
up?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Yep.
all right. So we have a couple data questions, a couple policy questions. So I'll just kind of go through these. And we do have some questions coming in through chat presently. One question was, do we know what maximum income is to be part of the bottom 1% is? So, we talked about the top 1%, but when we flip that to the bottom 1%, what does that look like?
I don't know offhand. Well, yeah, actually I do, right? Because I do know that offhand. Because if you look at this chart right here, right? So your minimum income needed to be in the top 1% is 400. And if you're making $410,000 a year, that is putting you in the top 1%. I also know, and I think it's important because we're about to have hopefully a big ballot fight over this, that if you have a taxable income of $250,000 a year, you are in the top 5% of income earners.
But in terms of being in the bottom 1%, I mean.
Oh, I'm sorry, you said
yeah, what's
bottom.
that? Yeah, what's that income like?
Yeah, well, I don't have that offhand. I think the self-sufficiency standard is gonna have that. Yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. We do have a question here on kind of following up on the statistic of 1/4 of middle income families have children in the home. So does that mean that, like, say 3/4 don't have children in a home? What do those distributions look like for the other income brackets, high income, low income? Do you have any kind of follow-ups on that?
I don't have that. I don't have that data. I don't think we did not. I don't believe we looked at percentage of kids in the home for upper income or lower income. I do think in the self-sufficiency report, you do find a lot of that for lower income. I think for us, the importance of this, I think it has a policy implication, because I think a lot of us in the public policy advocacy community, nothing moves people like cute kids. Politicians like cute kids, they don't like ugly adults. And I think often we make arguments, and you see these play out every election year about what's good for schools, what's good for ECE, what's good for that. But if only 1/4 of middle-class families in reality, have kids in the home, then that's not going to be as deeply resonant a talking point. So for me, this is kind of, that's important information because of how it intersects with our politics and the way we talk about those issues. And I think it's a bit of a cautionary tale. And it might explain why education funding measures, we think they're going to do really well. And at the end of the day, they really don't, because at the end of the day, there's not as many people out there struggling or grappling with these issues. So unfortunately, I don't have that information, but that's why I think that for us is an important thing to think about.
Okay, thanks. I had a question on, in terms of accessing the full report. Is that on your website, or is that something perhaps we could share when we send out, on our website when we provide the recording of this? Would that be possible?
Yeah, absolutely. It is on the Bell Policy Center's website. Just type in Colorado middle class in the search function, and you'll definitely find it. But I'll send you the link. Or here, let me see if I can just put it in the chat room.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Let's just keep firing here. So is the Colorado experience in terms of growing wealth gap and shrinking middle class, is that different from what is occurring in the rest of the U.S.? Does Colorado, kind of follow trend, or are we more of an outlier?
So in terms of inequality, and I think our report touched on this, but I know we've touched on it elsewhere. I mean, our inequality, we're right in the middle. As I recall, when I looked at, how we sort of rank in terms of inequality, we're in the sort of, in the 20s in terms of ranking. So we're not the worst, we're not the best. However, I think for us, the question is should the so-called number one economy, at least according to U.S. News and World Report, should the number one economy be 20th or 24th in the country for inequality. But no, based on everything I've seen, this report, and then some other rankings, we are middle of the pack when it comes to inequality.
Great, thanks. Question on the analysis here. Is age of householder considered in the analysis? It seems the analysis is only including a small portion of our households, if looking at household with one toddler and one school-age child. So,
Yeah.
Kind of what is the overall composition of our households by low, middle, and high income? And you might have touched on that earlier, but anything else you can expand on?
Yeah, the report, I mean, and again, this is why the child in the household, and this might be a bit of a stereotype, but I mean, I think that's why, again, if only a quarter of middle class families have kids in the household, then that means that, there certainly are families who maybe chose not to have kids who are younger, but I think the implication we also took from that is that our middle class is getting older. We know that Colorado is getting older from some of the great demographic data that's been put out by the demographer's office and others. So I don't know specifically. I think I encourage you to look at the report to see how that was factored into the analysis. But certainly one of my takeaways is that if only a quarter have kids in the household, then that means that you've got an awful lot of older Coloradans in that middle class category, which changes the picture. And again, I encourage everybody to look in their mind's eye. When I say middle class, who do you see? And do you see a family of four? Or do you see an older couple? And so I think that's why I think that point matters. But I think if you look at the report, you can see more about that analysis.
Great, thanks. And these following ones are more, I think, in the policy vein. And I'll just read this verbatim so I don't misinterpret what the individual's saying.
Okay.
But this person's read some of Bell Policy's papers on impacts from COVID. They call for increased taxes on the wealthy, reduced taxes on the lower 95%, and increased federal funding. They do not wish to cut Colorado welfare programs. So the question is, won't increases to federal funding, for example, which tends to increase asset values, exacerbate the wealth gap?
I want to make sure I understand that. So increasing federal funding exacerbate the wealth gap.
And Tim, you have access to talk. If you want to follow up on your question, that'd be great.
Sure. Look, if there are more dollars in the system and assets, I mean, we'd seen from the last time the country dumped out, money, asset values tend to increase. So it's the people who actually have money and assets that reap some of the benefits of those federal dollars. And so I guess the question I have is, are we potentially getting a Band-Aid for short-term pain at the expense of long-term, either, further increases in this wealth gap and a diminishing of the middle class that you kind of expressed concern for here?
No, I hear you. I mean, and obviously, this is I think this is a very political fight. I mean, for us, when we talk about, increasing levels of federal assistance, we want that money to be targeted. We want those dollars to not just go to our traditional welfare system, but we also want it to go to, independent contractors who are now on unemployment. We want it to go to employers that are keeping some of these middle class jobs available and open. So federally, I think there's got to be a whole conversation about how we really target, not just in our political rhetoric, but actually in the programs, target these dollars to the communities who need them, as opposed to those who, are very good at navigating the system, getting the resources that they need to preserve their own wealth or assets, and then growing the gap. From a state perspective, which is where I'm a lot more comfortable, what we've observed is, and that's why I think this report is so helpful, we have completely flipped in our higher education funding in the state. In 2000, we were picking up 2/3 of the family cost. Today, the family is picking up 2/3 of the cost. If we don't do something to improve the amount of subsidy that's going to higher education, I think we're going to continue to see a shrinking middle class. We've also been trying to shed some light on what we see as an unfair tax code. If you look at effective tax rate, when you look at state income tax, sales tax, property tax, you put it all together, the Department of Revenue shows very clearly some of the wealthiest Coloradans paying a smaller percentage of their overall income than lower and middle income Coloradans. So for us, at least at the state level, what we're trying to solve for is not only an inadequate tax code, i.e. not raising enough money for a healthy higher education subsidy or childcare system, but also a fairer tax system. But you're right. Like, I think that, if these programs aren't targeted, this isn't just about dumping money into, into the economy. It's about making sure that money is getting to where it needs to go. And it's not to say that wealthier individuals don't have value and enormous value in the economy. It's just that, as you point out, they're very good, or maybe you did, this is what I thought you were pointing out, that they're very good at navigating these programs and leveraging their assets and making sure that, and at the end of the day, what we also know is that they hold on to that money and they just don't spend it nearly as quickly in the economy as lower and middle income families do.
Yeah, look, I think that we can have a whole conversation on tax reform. We probably have, but yeah, maybe I have to have you back and talk about that as well.
Yeah, I would love that. And our governor has been interesting on this topic, and he's been trying to stimulate a conversation about tax reform too. And I think what's challenging is there's a revenue neutral conversation about tax reform, and then there's a revenue generating conversation about tax reform. And those can be different conversations, but I think we need to have both.
Thanks for that.
So it looks like we are at least out of the Q&A questions. I believe, Tim, you may have one more question you'd like to ask. And if you'd like to ask it, please feel free. And I think David might have one more question as well, just to put you through the ringer there, Scott. But okay. Yeah, really again appreciate you coming on, and this is great information. We really appreciate it.
Look, my other question, and this is kind of diverts a little maybe from where this presentation was, but you mentioned in your presentation that you need 2 income earners to get into middle class, and sometimes I wonder, we offer child support for 2 income earners, and is there a trade-off there between if 2 people are in a home are generating measurable income, are we doing that at the expense of raising kids? Because we're outsourcing the raising of kids. And does the Bell Policy Center spend much time thinking about that trade-off and whether it's good? Yeah,
we do. I do. And as you know, I think so. Yeah, I'm kind of veering from official Bell Policy Center doctrine here, but yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that there's a trade-off. Elizabeth Warren talked a lot about this during her campaign, and actually wrote quite a bit about it in her academic life, that there is a trade-off with 2 parents working, and that trade-off comes in the form of higher costs for childcare. I don't think that as an economy and a society, we really solved for that. Well, we just basically, as a society, moved to a place where both parents were working and never really figured out childcare. And so I think that has social repercussions that I think a lot of us are aware of, as well as economic repercussions. And so, I think we do at the Bell, we have a whole area, where we look at 2-generation economic policy. I mean, I think you see that a lot in the middle class, in higher education, where, we want to incentivize parents to go back to community college, say, right, and get that degree so that they can make more money in the workforce. Well, if they don't have childcare covered, it's going to make it very difficult for them to get that certificate or to move up. And so, I mean, I guess that's a long way of saying that I think that we have not in this country or in our state addressed the childcare pinch point that obviously is associated with two people working, and whether or not, and I think we all know people in our own lives, if we have not gone through this ourselves, who have made that calculation and said, yeah, I could go to this job and I could make $60,000 a year, but is that really worth it if I'm going to spend $40,000 a year on childcare or whatever, or actually it's $11,000 a year on childcare, and then all of these other, things. So like, we should delve more into that.
I actually think on that one, it's more than the economic question of what is that trade-off. I look at the social trade-off of outsourcing childcare. Yep. Because you said there, do I go back to college and get this degree so I can get a better job? I mean, part of my question is that might be a question you'd ask maybe once your children have left the home. But are we as a society, or should we be saying to them when kids are young, oh, you should think about this now and encourage this as a good option while you have really young children?
Well, right. And I guess, and then maybe we should take this offline so that we're not dominating. But I just would say, like,
absolutely.
But it's a dilemma. I'd say the dilemma, what this work seems to be demonstrating is that what we are saying is, if you want to be in the middle class, both of you need to be working. However, we're not going to do anything to help you. So I don't think we're giving people much of a choice. And I get that we're not a command and control economy. Therefore, it's not as simple as simply saying, like, no one decided this, but these are the economic circumstances that have come together, unfortunately, to say, if you are aspiring to be in the middle class, to make this kind of income, both of you have got to be working, and both of you probably need to be working in professional or managerial positions.
Thanks for the response.
Yeah, all right. We don't have any more questions coming in through the Q&A, so I think we will wrap up here. Again, thank you, Scott, for sharing this with us and sharing your research. We really appreciate it. And again, to everyone else, look for us on July 15th and for our next webinar. And I'll go ahead and end the meeting here.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yep.